In the grand halls of Aldermore Palace, where golden tapestries hide centuries of secrets and marble floors have witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, a crisis unfolds that will shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Queen Consort Isabella thought she had weathered every storm in her 20-year journey from commoner to crown. But nothing could prepare her for the moment when King Edmund, her husband and the man she sacrificed everything to love, would make a decision so devastating that it would leave her questioning not just their marriage, but her very place in a world that never truly accepted her. As whispers echo through corridors where servants dare not speak too loudly, and as the weight of tradition clashes with the harsh reality of modern scandal, one woman's tears will mark the beginning of the end of an era. For in the kingdom of Aldermore, some bonds are meant to be unbreakable until they shatter completely. What happens when love meets duty, when personal desires collide with royal obligations, and when the very institution meant to unite a nation becomes the force that tears apart those who serve it? The answer lies in 5 moments that changed everything. Moments that prove even crowns cannot protect the heart from breaking. The morning sun cast long shadows across the private dining room of Aldermore Palace as Queen Consort Isabella stirred her tea with trembling fingers. The delicate china cup, part of a set gifted by the Emperor of Japan, rattled against its saucer as she set it down. Across from her, King Edmund sat in stony silence, his eyes fixed on the morning papers spread before him like accusations. Isabella had learned to read her husband's moods over their 2 decades together. She knew the way his jaw tightened when Parliament challenged his decisions, how his fingers drummed against mahogany tables when foreign dignitaries tested his patience, and, most painfully, how his shoulders curved inward when the weight of kingship felt too heavy to bear. But this morning was different. This morning, Edmund looked like a man who had made peace with breaking someone's heart. The headlines screamed from every paper: royal marriage in crisis, palace insider reveals all, the queen consort's secret shame. Isabella's personal secretary, Margaret, had tried to hide them, but secrets had a way of finding their audience in the palace, no matter how well-intentioned the gatekeepers. "We need to discuss the Henderson situation," Edmund said finally, his voice carrying the formal tone he used during state functions. Isabella's heart sank. When her husband spoke to her like she was a visiting diplomat rather than his wife, she knew the conversation would leave scars. Lord Henderson, the palace's most trusted advisor for over 30 years, had been caught selling stories to the tabloids. Not just any stories, but intimate details about Isabella's past, her struggles with depression following 2 miscarriages, her complicated relationship with Edmund's children from his first marriage, and, most damaging of all, her recent friendship with Dr. James Morrison, her therapist who had become something more precious than professional help during the darkest period of her royal life. Isabella had done nothing wrong with Dr. Morrison. Their relationship remained strictly professional, but their weekly sessions had provided her with the emotional support she couldn't find within the palace walls. Henderson had twisted their therapeutic relationship into something sordid, selling photos of them sharing coffee after particularly difficult sessions, painting Isabella as an unstable woman seeking comfort outside her marriage. "Edmund, you know none of what Henderson said is true," Isabella began, but her husband raised his hand to silence her. The gesture hit her like a physical blow. In private, they had always been equals, partners navigating the impossible demands of royal life together. This formal distance felt like standing on opposite sides of a canyon. "The truth doesn't matter anymore, Isabella. You know this. What matters is perception, and the perception is that the monarchy's stability is compromised." Edmund's words were measured, rehearsed. Isabella realized with growing horror that this wasn't a discussion, it was a prepared statement. The palace had been her sanctuary for 20 years, but, suddenly, the ornate walls felt like they were closing in. She thought of the young woman she had been when she first met Edmund at a charity gala. She had been a school teacher then, passionate about education reform, and blissfully unaware of how love could become both salvation and destruction. Their courtship had been a fairy tale that captured the nation's imagination. A commoner who won the heart of a widowed king, bringing warmth back to a monarchy still mourning Edmund's first wife, Queen Sophia, who had died tragically young in a riding accident. The press had loved Isabella's genuine smile, her dedication to charitable causes, her obvious affection for Edmund's young son and daughter from his first marriage. But fairy tales, Isabella had learned, were written by people who had never lived in palaces. The reality was breakfast meetings about constitutional crises, lunch engagements where every word was analyzed for diplomatic implications, and dinners where the wrong fork choice could become tomorrow's scandal. The reality was smiling through state visits while battling crippling anxiety, supporting her stepchildren through their own struggles with public scrutiny, while her body repeatedly failed to give Edmund the heir the council desperately wanted. The miscarriages had broken something fundamental in Isabella, not just her dreams of motherhood, but her sense of purpose within the monarchy. An heir was expected, demanded even, and her body's betrayal felt like a personal failure that rippled through every aspect of royal life. The palace physicians were kind, but clinical. The royal gynecologist spoke in statistics and procedures, but none of them addressed the emotional devastation that followed each loss. Dr. Morrison had been different. Recommended by the palace's private medical staff, he specialized in treating patients dealing with grief and public pressure. Their sessions took place in a small, comfortable office far from the palace, where Isabella could speak freely about her fears, her loneliness, and her growing sense that she was failing everyone who depended on her. The sessions were therapeutic, nothing more, Isabella said, her voice stronger now. Dr. Morrison helped me through the darkest period of my life. Without him, I might not have survived the depression that followed our losses. Edmund's expression softened for just a moment, and Isabella glimpsed the man she had fallen in love with. He had grieved those lost pregnancies too, had held her through countless nights when sorrow felt like it might consume them both. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the mask of duty that had become his permanent expression. I believe you, he said quietly. But the council doesn't care about our grief or your healing. They care about stability, about the monarchy's reputation. Henderson's revelations have damaged that beyond repair. The King's Council had convened an emergency session 3 days earlier. Isabella hadn't been invited, despite the fact that the discussion centered entirely on her future. She had learned about their deliberations through Margaret, who had overheard conversations between Edmund and his private secretary, Sir Geoffrey Whitmore. The council's position was clear. Isabella had become a liability. Her mental health struggles, her need for outside therapeutic support, her inability to produce an heir, all of it painted a picture of a queen consort unfit for her role. The fact that Henderson had access to such intimate information proved, they argued, that Isabella's judgment was compromised. They want me gone, Isabella said, stating the obvious truth that hung between them like a sword. Edmund's silence was answer enough. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid that speaking slowly would make him lose his resolve. The council has prepared several options. An amicable separation, followed by a quiet divorce after a suitable period. You would retain your title as Duchess of Marlborough, receive a substantial settlement, and maintain residence at Thornfield Estate. You could continue your charitable work without the constraints of royal protocol. Isabella felt the world tilt around her. 20 years of marriage, 2 decades of serving her country, countless sacrifices made in the name of duty and love, all of it reduced to a financial settlement, and a country estate where she could be forgotten. And what about us? She whispered. What about our marriage, our love, the life we built together? Edmund's composure finally cracked. She saw tears forming in his eyes, but he blinked them away with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to suppress emotion in service of his role. My love for you has never wavered, Isabella. But I am king first, husband second. I cannot let personal feelings jeopardize the institution I swore to protect. The words hit her like physical blows. She had always known that the crown would demand sacrifices, but she had believed that their love was strong enough to withstand any challenge. She had been naive, perhaps, to think that 20 years of partnership meant more than constitutional concerns and public opinion polls. You're choosing them over me, she said, her voice barely audible. You're choosing the crown over our marriage. I'm choosing the stability of the realm over my personal happiness, Edmund replied. It's a choice every monarch before me has had to make, and it's a choice I pray my son will never have to face. Prince Alexander, Edmund's son from his first marriage, was 28 and showed no signs of settling down. The pressure for him to marry and produce heirs was mounting, but he had inherited his mother's independent spirit and his father's stubborn streak. Isabella loved him like her own child, had watched him grow from a grieving 10-year-old into a thoughtful, compassionate man who questioned every tradition placed before him. Alexander would never abandon someone he loved for political convenience, Isabella said, knowing the comparison would sting. He has more integrity than that. Edmund's face hardened. Alexander has the luxury of idealism because he's never worn the crown. When he becomes king, he'll understand that personal desires must sometimes be sacrificed for the greater good. Is that what this is? Sacrifice for the greater good. Isabella stood up, her chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like fingernails on glass. Or is this cowardice disguised as duty? The accusation hung in the air between them. In 20 years of marriage, they had fought about many things: his long absences on state visits, her struggles with depression, the pressure to produce an heir. But they had never questioned each other's fundamental character. Isabella immediately regretted her words, but the damage was done. Edmund stood as well, every inch the monarch now. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of centuries of royal tradition. You forget yourself, Isabella. You forget where you are and who you're speaking to. I'm speaking to my husband, she replied, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Or at least, I thought I was. But I see now that he's been replaced by a stranger who values public opinion more than private loyalty. The breakfast room, decorated with portraits of Edmund's ancestors, felt oppressive now. Kings and queens from centuries past stared down at them with painted eyes that seemed to judge Isabella for her emotional outburst. She had never felt like she belonged among those regal faces, and now she understood why. She had always been an outsider in this world, tolerated but never truly accepted. The council meets again tomorrow, Edmund said, his voice returning to that formal, distant tone. They expect an answer about your willingness to consider their proposal. I would recommend cooperation. It would make the transition easier for everyone involved. Isabella stared at her husband, searching his face for any sign of the man who had once told her that their love was stronger than any crown. She found nothing but duty and resignation, as if he had already buried his personal feelings so deeply that they no longer existed. I need time to think, she said finally. This isn't a decision I can make over breakfast. Edmund nodded. Take whatever time you need. But understand that delay won't change the fundamental situation. The monarchy cannot survive another scandal, and your presence here makes that inevitable. Isabella walked toward the door, then paused with her hand on the ornate handle. Tell me honestly, Edmund, if you could choose again, knowing everything you know now, would you still have married me? The question hung in the air for a long moment. Isabella could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, each second marking the death of another piece of her heart. I would have loved you from a distance, Edmund said finally. Loved you enough to spare you this pain. Isabella nodded once and left the room, closing the door behind her with the gentleness she had learned was expected of queens. In the hallway, she walked slowly past the portraits of Edmund's family, past the Italian marble sculptures that had witnessed centuries of royal drama, past the windows that looked out on gardens where she had once imagined watching her children play. Margaret was waiting for her in the private sitting room, her face a mask of professional concern that couldn't quite hide her personal anguish. She had been Isabella's companion through every triumph and tragedy of the past 20 years, and her loyalty had never wavered. Your Majesty, Margaret began, but Isabella held up a hand. Please, not today. Today I'm just Isabella, a woman whose world is falling apart. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. What can I do? Help me understand how we got here, Isabella said, sinking into her favorite armchair, the one Edmund had bought for her birthday 3 years ago, because she had mentioned that the formal palace furniture was uncomfortable for reading. Help me understand how 20 years of love and service can be erased by a few lies in the tabloids. Margaret sat across from her, abandoning protocol for the friendship that had sustained them both through countless crises. It's not just the tabloids, ma'am. It's the broader context. The monarchy's approval ratings have been declining for years. The younger generation questions the relevance of the institution. Parliament is increasingly resistant to funding royal activities. The council sees you as a symbol of everything that's wrong, an outsider who couldn't fulfill her primary duty of producing an heir, who requires medical support for mental health issues, who represents the monarchy's failure to modernize while maintaining tradition. Isabella absorbed this analysis with growing clarity. She had been so focused on her personal relationship with Edmund that she had failed to see the larger political forces at work. She was being sacrificed not because of her individual failures, but because she had become a convenient scapegoat for institutional problems that predated her arrival and would continue long after her departure. They need someone to blame, she said. And I'm the perfect target. The commoner who never really belonged, who couldn't give them an heir, who needed therapy to cope with royal life. I represent everything they want to distance themselves from. Margaret nodded sadly. The council believes that removing you will allow them to reset the narrative. Prince Alexander can make a fresh start when his time comes, perhaps with a bride who better fits their image of modern royalty. Isabella thought about the young women who had been photographed with Alexander recently, sophisticated daughters of nobility who moved through royal circles with ease, who had been trained from birth for this kind of life. None of them would need therapy to cope with the pressure. None of them would struggle with depression after pregnancy losses. None of them would be naive enough to believe that love could triumph over political necessity. I was such a fool, Isabella whispered. I actually believe that Edmund loved me more than he loved his crown. He does love you, Margaret said fiercely. I've watched you both for 20 years. I've seen him when he thinks no one is looking, seen how he lights up when you enter a room, seen how he fought the council's attempts to control your charitable work, your public appearances, your very existence. This is breaking his heart too. Then, why isn't he fighting for us now? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. Because he's afraid. The monarchy is more fragile than the public realizes. Scotland is pushing for independence again, Northern Ireland's loyalties are wavering, and even England is questioning whether they need a king. If public opinion turns completely against the royal family, the institution could collapse within a generation. Edmund believes that sacrificing his personal happiness is the price he must pay to preserve something larger than himself. Isabella understood the logic, even as it destroyed her. Edmund wasn't just abandoning her. He was abandoning himself, his own happiness, his own heart. It was both admirable and tragic, noble and cowardly, the kind of impossible choice that had crushed generations of royalty before them. What would you do, Margaret, if you were in my position? Margaret smiled sadly. I would remember that dignity is the one thing they can't take from you without your permission. Whatever you choose it as yourself, not as what they want you to be. Isabella spent the rest of the day walking through the palace gardens, retracing paths she had walked thousands of times before. She thought about the young teacher who had fallen in love with a grieving king, about the woman who had tried so hard to be worthy of a crown, about the person she might have been if she had never entered this golden cage. As evening approached, she found herself in the rose garden where Edmund had proposed 21 years ago. The roses were different now. Climate change had forced the gardeners to plant hardier varieties, but the spot remained sacred in her memory. She sat on the same stone bench where she had said yes to a future she couldn't possibly have imagined. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Morrison. Saw the headlines. Are you okay? Here if you need to talk. Isabella stared at the message for a long time. His professional concern had been twisted into scandal, his therapeutic support painted as something inappropriate. But she knew the truth. He had helped her find herself again when grief threatened to consume her completely. Their relationship was healing, not betrayal, growth not scandal. She typed back, "Thank you. I'm stronger than they think." As she sent the message, Isabella realized something important had shifted. For 20 years, she had measured her worth by others' expectations, the council's approval, the public's affection, Edmund's love. But Margaret was right. Dignity was something she could choose for herself. She would not go quietly into exile, accepting blame for failures that were not entirely her own. She would not pretend that her marriage had failed due to her inadequacies alone. She would not allow herself to be erased from history as a footnote about the king's unfortunate second wife. But neither would she destroy the institution that Edmund was willing to sacrifice everything to protect. There had to be a third option, a way to preserve her dignity while recognizing the impossible position they all found themselves in. As the sun set behind the palace walls, Isabella began to formulate a plan. Tomorrow's council meeting would not find her defenseless or defeated. She would face them as the queen consort she had worked 20 years to become, gracious but not weak, accommodating but not complicit in her own destruction. The woman who had once been brave enough to love a king would find the courage to love herself enough to demand better. The palace might be preparing to cut its ties with her, but Isabella was preparing to redefine what those ties had meant in the first place. This was her story too, and she would not allow others to write its ending without her voice being heard. The king's council chamber had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the declaration of wars, and the negotiation of peace treaties that shaped nations. Its oak-paneled walls, lined with portraits of advisors who had served the crown for centuries, seemed to absorb sound and secrets with equal efficiency. Today, those same walls would bear witness to a modern kind of warfare, the systematic dismantling of a queen's life. Isabella arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, her burgundy dress chosen for its authority rather than beauty, her grandmother's pearls serving as armor against what was to come. She had spent the sleepless night preparing not just her arguments, but her resolve. Margaret walked beside her, carrying a leather portfolio that contained documents Isabella hoped she wouldn't need to use. Sir Geoffrey Whitmore, the king's private secretary, stood at the chamber's entrance like a sentinel. His pale blue eyes, which had always regarded Isabella with barely concealed disapproval, now held something approaching pity. It was almost more insulting than his usual disdain. "Your Majesty," he said with a slight bow that managed to convey respect and condescension simultaneously. "The council is assembled and waiting." Isabella nodded, drawing herself up to her full height. She had learned over the years that posture was power in rooms like this, that the way she entered would set the tone for everything that followed. She walked through the doors with the measured pace of a woman who belonged there, even though she knew this might be the last time she would ever set foot in this chamber. The 12 members of the King's Council were arranged around an enormous mahogany table that dominated the room. These were the most powerful people in the kingdom: former prime ministers, military leaders, constitutional scholars, and hereditary nobles whose families had influenced royal policy for generations. Isabella had attended hundreds of meetings with these individuals over the years, but she had never felt their collective hostility so acutely. At the head of the table sat Edmund, his face a mask of royal neutrality that gave away nothing of the private pain they had shared the day before. To his right was Lord Chancellor Pemberton, a man whose legal mind was matched only by his political ruthlessness. To his left sat the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose presence reminded everyone that this was not just a political matter, but a moral one as well. "Your Majesty," Lord Chancellor Pemberton began, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We appreciate your presence here today. As you know, recent events have created a situation that requires immediate and decisive action." Isabella took her seat at the far end of the table, the physical distance emphasizing her isolation from the group. Margaret remained standing behind her chair, a small gesture of support that did not go unnoticed by the council members. "I understand your concerns," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "However, I believe there are aspects of this situation that require clarification before any decisions are made." Lord Pemberton exchanged glances with several other council members. They had clearly expected a more submissive response, perhaps tears or pleas for understanding. Isabella's calm professionalism seemed to unsettle them. General Morrison, the Chief of Defense Staff, leaned forward with the aggressive posture of a man accustomed to military strategy. "Your Majesty, with respect, this is not a negotiation. The damage to the monarchy's reputation is severe and continuing. Every day that passes without resolution makes the situation worse." "And what exactly constitutes resolution, General?" Isabella asked. "Are we here to discuss how to address the actual problems facing the monarchy, or are we here to find someone to blame for those problems?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Lady Blackwood, one of only 2 women on the council and historically Isabella's strongest supporter, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had built her political career on advancing women's causes, but institutional loyalty trumped personal principles in this room. "The proposal before us is straightforward," she said, avoiding eye contact with Isabella. "A period of separation followed by an amicable divorce would allow both parties to move forward with dignity. Your charitable work could continue unencumbered by royal protocol, and the monarchy could begin the process of rehabilitation." Isabella opened the leather portfolio Margaret had prepared and withdrew a thick folder. "Before we discuss that proposal, I think it's important that everyone understands the full scope of what's being suggested. Margaret, would you please distribute these documents to the council?" Margaret moved around the table, placing identical folders in front of each member. Isabella watched their faces as they opened the documents, seeing confusion give way to concern as they realized what they were looking at. "These are copies of every major charitable initiative I've led over the past 20 years, Isabella explained. Educational reform programs that have improved literacy rates in underserved communities by 37%. Mental health awareness campaigns that have contributed to a 22% reduction in suicide rates among young people. International development projects that have provided clean water access to over 2 million people." Lord Pemberton frowned at the documents. "Your charitable work is commendable, Your Majesty, but it's not relevant to the current crisis." "Isn't it?" Isabella challenged. "These programs don't exist in isolation. They exist because the queen consort championed them, because the monarchy lent its credibility and influence to causes that might otherwise have been ignored. If I leave quietly, these initiatives lose their primary advocate. The real-world impact of my departure extends far beyond palace politics. Archbishop Williams, who had remained silent until now, spoke with the measured cadence of someone choosing his words carefully. Your Majesty raises important points about the positive impact of your work. However, we must also consider the spiritual and moral dimensions of this crisis. The monarchy's role as defender of faith and traditional values has been compromised. Isabella had expected this line of attack. The archbishop was a traditionalist who had never fully embraced the idea of a divorced king remarrying, even though he had performed their wedding ceremony with apparent enthusiasm. Your Grace, she replied, I would argue that seeking professional help for mental health challenges actually demonstrates moral strength, not weakness. Would you suggest that someone suffering from diabetes should reject medical treatment to avoid appearing weak? Mental health is health, and pretending otherwise perpetuates dangerous stigma. That's not the issue, General Morrison interjected impatiently. The issue is that your private struggles have become public ammunition for Republicans who want to abolish the monarchy entirely. Every tabloid story about your therapy sessions, every speculation about your marriage, every hint of instability becomes a weapon against the institution. Isabella felt her carefully maintained composure begin to fray. So the solution is to sacrifice the person who sought help rather than address the system that made that help necessary? Edmund finally spoke, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had aged years in the past few days. Isabella, no one is questioning your character or the value of your contributions. But we must be realistic about the current situation. The Henderson revelations have created a narrative that we cannot control or counter effectively. Have we tried? Isabella asked pointedly. Have we issued statements explaining the importance of mental health support? Have we used this as an opportunity to modernize the monarchy's approach to personal struggles? Or have we simply accepted defeat without attempting to fight back? Sir Geoffrey cleared his throat diplomatically. Your Majesty, the communication strategy has been carefully considered. Public statements defending the Queen Consort's therapy sessions would only draw more attention to the underlying issues. Sometimes the best response is strategic silence. Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Strategic silence. Is that what we're calling cowardice now? The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Even Margaret shifted nervously behind Isabella's chair. Directly challenging the council's decision-making process was unprecedented, and everyone in the room understood that lines were being crossed. Lord Pemberton's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Your Majesty, I must remind you that this council serves at His Majesty's pleasure and acts in the best interests of the realm. Our decisions are not subject to personal attack. And I must remind you, Isabella replied, standing up so that she commanded the room's attention, that I am not merely a subject of this realm. I am a member of the royal family who has served with distinction for 20 years. I deserve better than being discarded like an inconvenient piece of furniture when political winds shift. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella could see the shock on every face around the table. Queen's consort simply did not speak this way to the King's Council. They accepted decisions gracefully, perhaps offering gentle suggestions, but never direct confrontation. Lady Blackwood attempted to restore some semblance of diplomatic courtesy. Your Majesty, I think what the Council is trying to convey is that there are no good options available. We all recognize your contributions and your personal sacrifice. The proposed separation would be conducted with the utmost respect for your position and achievements. Isabella remained standing, her hands flat on the table as she leaned forward slightly. Let me propose an alternative. Instead of running from this crisis, we face it directly. We acknowledge that the Queen Consort sought therapeutic support during a difficult period. We explain that this is normal, healthy behavior that should be praised rather than condemned. We use this moment to demonstrate that the monarchy has evolved beyond outdated notions of perfection and invulnerability. Absolutely not, General Morrison stated flatly. That approach would confirm every criticism of royal weakness and instability. It would be professional suicide for the institution. Would it? Isabella challenged. Or would it show that the royal family consists of real human beings who face the same challenges as their subjects? Young people struggling with mental health issues might find hope in knowing that even a queen consort needed help and found the strength to seek it. The archbishop shook his head sadly. Your Majesty, I fear you underestimate the conservative nature of our society. Many people want their royalty to embody ideals of strength and stability. Admitting to vulnerability, even therapeutic vulnerability, undermines that expectation. Isabella felt the futility of her position settling over her like a weight. These were intelligent, well-intentioned people, but they were trapped in a worldview that saw vulnerability as weakness and change as danger. They genuinely believed that protecting the monarchy required sacrificing anyone who might threaten its carefully constructed image of perfection. "So we return to the original proposal," she said, settling back into her chair with evident reluctance. The convenient exile of the problematic queen consort. Edmund's mask of neutrality finally slipped slightly. Isabella caught a glimpse of the pain he was working so hard to hide, the cost of choosing duty over personal loyalty. It almost made her forgive him. Almost. The terms of separation would be generous, Lord Pemberton continued, apparently interpreting Isabella's resignation as acceptance. Thornfield Estate is a beautiful property with complete privacy and substantial grounds. The financial settlement would ensure your comfort and independence for life. Your title as Duchess of Marlborough would be retained, allowing you to continue your charitable work under your own name rather than as a representative of the crown. Isabella listened to the details with growing understanding of how thoroughly they had planned her exile. Thornfield Estate was indeed beautiful. It was also 3 hours from London and far from any major media centers. The title of Duchess of Marlborough carried prestige, but no real political power. The financial settlement was generous enough to ensure she would never need to seek employment or support, effectively removing any economic incentive to write tell-all memoirs or grant damaging interviews. "You've thought of everything," she said with bitter admiration. "The golden cage is spacious and well-appointed. All I have to do is accept my banishment gracefully." "It's not banishment," Lady Blackwood protested. "It's a new beginning, an opportunity for both you and His Majesty to find peace and purpose outside the constraints of a relationship that has become complicated." Isabella almost laughed at the euphemism. 20 years of marriage, 2 decades of partnership and mutual support had become complicated because a disgruntled employee had sold lies to tabloids hungry for royal scandal. "I have a counter-proposal," she said suddenly, surprising herself as much as the council. She had not planned this moment, but clarity was emerging from her anger and despair. "I'm listening," Edmund said, speaking for the first time in several minutes. Isabella stood again, but this time her posture was different. Instead of defensive confrontation, she projected the quiet confidence of someone who had found her path forward. "I will accept a trial separation of 1 year. During that time, I will relocate to Thornfield Estate and step back from official royal duties. However, I will not agree to divorce proceedings until that year has concluded. I will continue my charitable work, but I will be completely transparent about my status and my reasons for stepping back from royal life." The council members exchanged alarmed glances. This was not the quiet disappearance they had envisioned. "What do you mean by transparency?" Sir Geoffrey asked suspiciously. "I mean that if asked directly about my separation from His Majesty, I will tell the truth. I will explain that I sought therapy during a difficult period in my life, that this therapy was twisted into scandal by someone who betrayed the trust of the royal household, and that the King's Council decided I had become a liability to the monarchy's reputation. I will not lie to protect an institution that refuses to protect its own members." The room erupted in protests. Lord Pemberton was practically sputtering in outrage. "That would be unprecedented. You cannot make public statements criticizing council decisions." "I can and I will," Isabella replied calmly. "Unless, of course, you would prefer to reconsider your current approach and find a way to weather this crisis without sacrificing a family member on the altar of public opinion." Edmund leaned back in his chair, studying his wife with what might have been admiration. "Isabella, what you're proposing would be incredibly damaging to the monarchy." "More damaging than the current approach?" she asked. "More damaging than confirming every criticism that the royal family abandons its own members at the first sign of difficulty? More damaging than demonstrating that 20 years of faithful service counts for nothing when political convenience demands a scapegoat?" Archbishop Williams cleared his throat delicately. "Your Majesty, surely you can see that public criticism of royal decision-making would set a dangerous precedent. If former members of the royal family felt free to air grievances publicly, the institution could not survive." Isabella smiled for the first time since entering the chamber, but it was not a pleasant expression. "Your Grace, former members of the royal family already air their grievances publicly." The difference is that they usually wait until they've been completely ostracized before doing so. I'm simply offering advance notice. The threat was clear, and everyone in the room understood its implications. Isabella was not the naive schoolteacher who had entered royal life 20 years ago. She was an experienced public figure with deep knowledge of royal operations, personal relationships with international leaders, and intimate understanding of the monarchy's vulnerabilities. You're asking us to choose between two unacceptable options, General Morrison said bluntly. Keep you and risk ongoing scandal, or lose you and risk devastating revelations. I'm asking you to choose between short-term political convenience and long-term institutional integrity, Isabella corrected. I'm asking you to consider whether protecting the monarchy might sometimes require defending its members rather than discarding them. The debate continued for another 2 hours, but the fundamental positions had been established. The council wanted Isabella gone quickly and quietly. Isabella was willing to go, but not quietly and not permanently. The stalemate was as complete as it was unprecedented. Finally, Edmund called for a recess. We will reconvene tomorrow morning, he announced. I suggest everyone use the intervening time to consider whether there might be alternative approaches that better serve all parties involved. As the council members filed out, several of them shot Isabella looks that ranged from grudging respect to outright hostility. She had fundamentally altered the dynamic of the situation, transforming herself from supplicant to equal partner in negotiations. Lady Blackwood paused at the door and turned back toward Isabella. You realize, she said quietly, that you're playing a very dangerous game. No more dangerous than the game you've been playing with my life, Isabella replied. The difference is that now we're all aware of the stakes. When the chamber was empty except for Isabella, Margaret, and Edmund, the formal atmosphere dissolved into something more personal, but no less painful. That was well done, Edmund said, and Isabella could hear the genuine admiration in his voice. I had forgotten how formidable you could be when cornered. I learned from the best, Isabella replied. 20 years of watching you navigate impossible political situations taught me that sometimes the only way to win is to change the rules of the game. Edmund stood and walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of her. For a moment, they were not king and estranged queen, but simply two people who had loved each other and found themselves on opposite sides of an impossible situation. You know this can't end well for either of us, he said softly. Either we destroy each other in public, or we find a way to separate that preserves some dignity for both of us. Isabella looked into the eyes of the man she had loved for 2 decades and saw the weariness of someone who had sacrificed too much for too long. Then, let's find that third way, Edmund. Let's prove that even in this mess, we can still be the people we promised each other we would be. As she left the chamber, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not for reconciliation. That door seemed permanently closed, but for resolution that honored the complexity of their situation rather than reducing it to simplistic narratives of success and failure. The palace was preparing to cut its ties with her, but Isabella was discovering that she had more power to shape those cuts than anyone had anticipated. Tomorrow's meeting would determine whether that power could be used to create something better than the destruction they all seemed to be hurtling toward. The storm that had been brewing for days finally broke at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, when Margaret burst into Isabella's private sitting room with tears streaming down her face and a tablet clutched in her trembling hands. Isabella, who had spent another sleepless night staring at the ceiling and rehearsing arguments for the day's continued council negotiations, took one look at her assistant's expression and felt her world shift on its axis. Ma'am, Margaret whispered, her voice broken. You need to see this. The headline blazed across the screen like a wound. Queen Consort's suicide attempt covered up by palace. Below it, a photograph of Isabella leaving Dr. Morrison's office, her face drawn and exhausted, taken clearly without her knowledge or consent. The accompanying article, bylined by Henderson himself, detailed what he claimed were Isabella's multiple psychiatric crises and alleged that she had been hospitalized secretly following what he described as a serious attempt at self-harm. Every word was a lie. Every carefully crafted sentence was designed to paint Isabella as unstable, dangerous to herself, and unfit for royal duties. But the photographs were real. Henderson had documented her most vulnerable moments and twisted them into a narrative that would be impossible to refute without revealing private medical information. Isabella read the article 3 times, her hands growing steadier with each pass as shock gave way to cold fury. Henderson hadn't just betrayed her trust. He had weaponized her pursuit of mental health support and turned it into the very scandal that would justify her removal from royal life. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Someone had orchestrated this release to coincide with the council's deliberations. "How bad is the pickup?" Isabella asked, her voice unnaturally calm. Margaret wiped her eyes and consulted her phone. "Every major outlet has it. International coverage is already beginning. The palace press office has issued a no-comment statement, which is being interpreted as confirmation." Isabella stood and walked to the window that overlooked the gardens where she had once found peace. Now even those carefully manicured landscapes seemed like stage sets designed to maintain illusions that were crumbling around her. "Call Dr. Morrison," she said quietly. "Warn him about what's coming. His practice will be under siege within hours." "Ma'am, I should mention that he's already released a statement. He confirmed that you were his patient, but denied any of Henderson's specific claims. He said that discussing your treatment would violate patient confidentiality, but he wanted people to know that seeking therapy is a sign of strength, not weakness." Isabella felt a surge of gratitude for the man who had helped her through the darkest period of her life. While the palace had abandoned her to political necessity, Dr. Morrison was risking his professional reputation to defend the truth about their therapeutic relationship. "He's braver than all of us," she murmured. Then, louder, "Get Sir Geoffrey on the phone. I need to know if the council is going to stand by their no-comment strategy or if they're planning to throw me to the wolves completely." Margaret was reaching for her phone when it buzzed with an incoming call. Her face went white as she looked at the caller ID. "It's His Majesty," she said. Isabella had been expecting this call, but the reality of it still hit her like a physical blow. 24 hours ago, they had been negotiating the terms of separation. Now Edmund was calling in response to the most damaging scandal of her royal career. "Your Majesty," she answered formally, putting the call on speaker so Margaret could take notes. "Isabella." Edmund's voice was tight with strain. "I assume you've seen the Henderson story." "I have. And I assume you're calling to tell me that the council's timeline has been accelerated." There was a long pause. "The emergency session convenes in 1 hour. Lord Pemberton is recommending immediate implementation of separation proceedings. The damage control team believes that swift action is the only way to contain this scandal." Isabella felt the walls of her life collapsing inward, but her voice remained steady. "And what do you believe, Edmund?" Another pause, longer this time. When Edmund spoke again, his voice was heavy with exhaustion. "I believe that we've lost control of the narrative completely. I believe that every day you remain officially connected to the crown makes the situation worse for both of us." "I see." Isabella walked away from the window and sat down heavily in the armchair that had become her refuge during countless crises. "And I assume the council has prepared statements explaining my sudden departure?" "The prepared statement indicates that you are taking an extended leave of absence for health reasons, with the full support and understanding of the royal family. After an appropriate period, a more permanent arrangement will be announced." Isabella almost laughed at the euphemisms. Health reasons. Extended leave. Appropriate period. The language was designed to suggest that this was her choice, her need for privacy and recovery, rather than her forced removal from royal life. "How convenient that Henderson's lies align so perfectly with the council's preferred narrative," she said. "Now they don't have to justify removing a loyal queen consort. They can simply express concern for a troubled woman who needs time away from public duties." "Isabella, please don't make this harder than it has to be." The pleading note in Edmund's voice was her undoing. For a moment, she heard the man she had fallen in love with, the person who had held her through grief and celebrated her triumphs, and promised that they would face whatever challenges came their way together. But that man was gone, replaced by a monarch who viewed their marriage as a political liability that could no longer be tolerated. "Harder for whom?" she asked, her careful composure finally cracking. "Harder for you? Harder for the council? Harder for the institution that you've decided is more important than the woman who has served it faithfully for 20 years. That's not fair, isn't it?" Isabella stood up again, pacing the room with growing agitation. "Tell me, Edmund, when Henderson first approached the tabloids with his stories, who made the decision not to fight back? When the first articles were published, who chose strategic silence over defending your wife? When the scandal began to threaten the monarchy's reputation, who decided that the easiest solution was to remove the problem rather than address it? The situation is more complex than you're acknowledging. The situation is exactly as simple as I'm describing, Isabella replied. You have a choice between protecting your institution and protecting your family. You've made your choice, and now you're asking me to make mine. Fine, I'll make it. But I'll make it publicly, and I'll make it honestly. What does that mean? Isabella took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 20 years of compromises and accommodations and strategic silences settling on her shoulders. She was done carrying that weight. It means that I will not slink away quietly to Thornfield Estate while you and the council construct comfortable lies about my departure. It means that I will not allow myself to be painted as unstable or unfit while the real story goes untold. It means that if you want me gone, you'll have to do it honestly. Isabella, listen to yourself. You're talking about destroying the monarchy over a personal grievance. I'm talking about saving my dignity and, perhaps, in the process, forcing an institution I've served faithfully to confront its own cowardice. Isabella's voice rose with each word. Do you know what the real tragedy is, Edmund? This crisis could have been an opportunity. We could have shown the world that the royal family consists of real people who face real challenges and find real solutions. We could have demonstrated that seeking help for mental health struggles is courageous, not shameful. We could have modernized the monarchy's relationship with vulnerability and authenticity. And instead, you're proving every Republican critic right. You're demonstrating that the royal family will sacrifice its own members the moment they become politically inconvenient. You're showing that titles and ceremonies and centuries of tradition matter more than loyalty and love and basic human decency. The silence that followed was filled with 20 years of shared history. Their wedding day, their early happiness, the losses they had grieved together, the challenges they had faced as a team. All of it was being dissolved by political necessity and institutional cowardice. The council is waiting, Edmund said finally. Will you attend the emergency session? Isabella looked around the sitting room that had been her sanctuary for 2 decades. The books she had collected from around the world, the photographs of charitable projects that had brought her deep satisfaction, the small personal treasures that had made the palace feel like home despite its impossible grandeur. All of it would soon be packed away, reduced to boxes and memories. I'll attend, she said, but not to negotiate my exile. I'll attend to tell the council exactly what I think of their decision and their methods. Isabella, you wanted honesty, Edmund. You wanted me to make this easier for everyone. Well, this is as easy as I can make it. I will not lie about why I'm leaving, and I will not pretend that this separation is mutual or amicable. If that makes things more difficult for the monarchy, perhaps the monarchy should have considered that before deciding to abandon one of its own. Isabella ended the call and immediately turned to Margaret, who had been taking notes with professional efficiency despite the tears that continued to flow down her cheeks. I need you to contact my solicitor immediately. I want a complete review of the separation agreement they're going to propose, with particular attention to any clauses that might restrict my ability to discuss my experiences publicly. Ma'am, are you certain about this course of action? Once you attend this meeting and make your position clear, there will be no way back. Isabella nodded. I've been trying to find a way back for days, Margaret. I've been hoping that love and loyalty and 20 years of partnership would count for something. But some doors, once closed, can't be reopened. Edmund has made his choice. The council has made theirs. Now I have to make mine. Margaret gathered her things and headed for the door, then paused. For what it's worth, ma'am, I think you're right to fight back. Someone needs to tell the truth about what's happening here. After Margaret left, Isabella stood alone in the room that had witnessed so many private moments of joy and sorrow. She thought about the young teacher who had fallen in love with a king, about the woman who had tried so hard to be worthy of a crown, about the person she had become through years of service and sacrifice. She was not the same person who had entered royal life 20 years ago. That woman had been eager to please, desperate to prove herself, willing to accept any limitation or constraint if it meant belonging to something larger than herself. The woman who would walk into the council chamber in less than an hour was stronger, more self-aware, and utterly unwilling to be erased without a fight. Isabella's phone buzzed with a text message from Prince Alexander. Saw the news. This is insane. Can we talk? She stared at the message for a long time. Alexander had always been more like a son to her than a stepson, and she knew that forcing the royal family to choose sides would be painful for him. But she also knew that remaining silent would teach him that love and loyalty were expendable when political pressures mounted. She typed back, after the council meeting. There are things you need to understand about how this family really works. The next text came from Princess Charlotte, Alexander's younger sister. Whatever happens, I love you. You've been the mother I needed when I lost my own. Isabella's careful composure finally shattered completely. The idea that she would lose her relationships with Edmund's children, young people she had helped raise and guide through their own struggles with public scrutiny, was almost more painful than losing her marriage. But Charlotte's message reminded her why this fight was necessary. Someone had to demonstrate that love and loyalty and basic human decency were worth defending, even when institutions preferred expedience. As Isabella prepared for the most important confrontation of her royal career, she realized that she was no longer fighting just for herself. She was fighting for every future member of the royal family who might find themselves vulnerable and isolated when political pressures demanded a sacrifice. She was fighting for the idea that titles came with responsibilities that went both ways, that institutions existed to serve their members as much as their members existed to serve institutions. The palace bells were chiming 9 o'clock as Isabella made her final preparations. In 30 minutes, she would walk into the council chamber as queen consort for what might be the last time. But she would walk out as herself, honest, dignified, and unwilling to accept blame for failures that belonged to everyone who had chosen political convenience over personal loyalty. The breaking point had arrived, and Isabella was finally ready to let everything shatter so that something truer could take its place. The woman who had once been brave enough to love a king would now discover if she was brave enough to save herself. The emergency session of the King's Council convened in an atmosphere of barely controlled panic. Isabella arrived to find the chamber buzzing with urgent conversations that ceased abruptly when she entered. The Henderson story had dominated morning news cycles across 3 continents, and the palace press office was fielding hundreds of calls from journalists hungry for any additional details about the Queen Consort's alleged mental health crisis. Sir Geoffrey Whitmore met her at the door with an expression that managed to convey both professional courtesy and personal distaste. Your Majesty, the Council has prepared a comprehensive response plan that we hope will contain the current situation and provide a path forward. Isabella nodded but said nothing as she took her seat at the far end of the table. Margaret remained standing behind her chair, a small gesture of solidarity that felt monumentally important in a room where Isabella had no other allies. The 12 council members were arranged in their traditional positions, but their usual air of confident authority had been replaced by the tension of people managing a crisis that had spiraled beyond their control. Lord Chancellor Pemberton's face was grim. General Morrison looked like a man preparing for battle, and even the normally unflappable Archbishop Williams appeared deeply troubled. Edmund sat at the head of the table in his role as king, but Isabella could see the exhaustion that shadowed his features. She wondered if he had slept at all, or if he had spent the night wrestling with the consequences of choices that seemed inevitable but felt like betrayal. Your Majesty, Lord Pemberton began without preamble. The Henderson revelations have created an untenable situation that requires immediate action. The damage to the monarchy's reputation is severe and continuing to escalate with each hour that passes without resolution. Isabella remained silent, waiting for him to complete his prepared presentation before she responded. She had learned over the years that allowing opponents to finish their arguments completely often revealed weaknesses and inconsistencies that could be exploited. The communications team has prepared a statement announcing that you are taking an extended leave of absence for health reasons, Pemberton continued. This statement emphasizes the royal family's complete support for your decision and frames your departure as a positive step toward recovery and well-being. He slid a document across the table toward her. Isabella read it carefully, noting how skillfully the language managed to confirm every one of Henderson's implications while appearing to be supportive and caring. The statement was a masterpiece of public relations manipulation, designed to make the Queen Consort's forced exile appear to be her own choice for her own benefit. The separation agreement has been updated to reflect the urgency of the situation, Lady Blackwood added, producing another folder of documents. The financial arrangements remain generous, but the timeline has been accelerated. We recommend immediate relocation to Thornfield Estate, effective tomorrow morning. Isabella finished reading both documents and set them aside without signing anything. When she looked up, every person in the room was watching her with varying degrees of expectation and apprehension. This is elegant work, she said finally. Whoever crafted these documents understands the psychology of crisis management very well. The narrative is internally consistent, politically convenient, and nearly impossible to challenge without appearing petty or vindictive. Several council members relaxed slightly, interpreting her calm tone as acquiescence. They were mistaken. However, Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger. There's one significant problem with this approach. It's predicated on my cooperation, and I withdraw that cooperation effective immediately. The room erupted in alarmed murmurs. Lord Pemberton leaned forward aggressively. Your Majesty, surely you understand that cooperation at this point is not optional. The situation has moved beyond personal preferences or wounded feelings. Has it? Isabella asked. Then, let me clarify the situation as I understand it. Henderson, a trusted palace employee, has spent months collecting information about my private medical care. Someone with access to my schedule and movements provided him with opportunities to photograph me during vulnerable moments. Someone with knowledge of the council's deliberations coordinated the release of his story to coincide with these emergency sessions. This wasn't a random betrayal by a disgruntled employee. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign to create the very crisis you're now using to justify my removal. The silence that followed was profound. Isabella had voiced what several council members had suspected, but no one had been willing to acknowledge. The timing and coordination of Henderson's revelations suggested a level of planning that went far beyond one man's opportunistic betrayal. General Morrison's military training allowed him to recover first. Your Majesty, even if there were coordination, it doesn't change the fundamental problem. The story is public, the damage is done, and continuing to debate its origins won't make it disappear. You're absolutely right, Isabella agreed. The story is public, and it won't disappear. But that means we have two choices. We can let Henderson's lies define the narrative, or we can tell the truth loudly enough to compete with those lies. Archbishop Williams shook his head sadly. Your Majesty, truth is a luxury we cannot afford in this situation. Sometimes protecting the greater good requires accepting lesser injustices. Isabella stood up, her patience with diplomatic language finally exhausted. Your Grace, with respect, that's exactly the kind of thinking that has brought us to this point. For 20 years, I have accepted lesser injustices in service of the greater good. I have smiled through humiliating scrutiny of my body's failure to produce an heir. I have endured constant criticism of my background, my qualifications, my worthiness to be part of this family. I have allowed my every public appearance to be analyzed for signs of weakness or instability. I have accepted that my private struggles with grief and depression should be hidden away like shameful secrets. She walked around the table as she spoke, her voice growing more passionate with each sentence. I have accommodated and compromised and sacrificed my own dignity again and again because I believed that serving the monarchy was worth any personal cost. But this time, the cost they're asking me to pay is not just my dignity. It's my truth, my integrity, and my right to define my own story. Lord Pemberton tried to interrupt, but Isabella continued speaking, her words carrying the authority of someone who had finally found her voice after years of diplomatic silence. Henderson's story is a lie. My therapy sessions were not evidence of instability. They were evidence of my commitment to being the best queen consort I could be. Seeking professional help after pregnancy losses was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength and self-awareness. My relationship with Dr. Morrison was not inappropriate. It was healing and necessary, and something I'm proud of rather than ashamed of. She stopped walking and faced the council directly, her hands clasped behind her back in the posture of someone delivering a formal address. If I accept your proposal and disappear quietly to Thornfield Estate, I become complicit in the lie that there was something wrong with seeking help, something shameful about prioritizing mental health, something inappropriate about refusing to suffer in silence. I will not do that. Edmund finally spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible choices. Isabella, what you're proposing would be devastating for the monarchy. If you publicly contradict the official narrative, if you provide details about council deliberations, if you challenge the institution's right to make these decisions, you will damage something far larger than yourself. Will I? Isabella asked. Or will I force an institution that desperately needs modernization to confront its own failures? Will I demonstrate that the monarchy can survive transparency and accountability and honest acknowledgement of human frailty? She walked back to her seat, but remained standing, her position at the table emphasizing her isolation from the group. For generations, Members of this family have sacrificed their personal happiness for institutional stability. They have endured loveless marriages, hidden mental illness, suppressed their authentic selves, and accepted exile when they became politically inconvenient. And where has it gotten us? Isabella gestured toward the window, beyond which protesters had been gathering for days. Public support for the monarchy is at historic lows. Young people see the institution as irrelevant at best, oppressive at worst. Republicans gain ground with every scandal, every revelation of institutional callousness, every demonstration that the royal family exists in a bubble isolated from the realities of modern life. General Morrison attempted to regain control of the conversation. Your Majesty, those are long-term challenges that can be addressed through careful strategy and modernization efforts. The immediate crisis requires immediate solutions. The immediate crisis is a symptom of those long-term challenges, Isabella countered. You want to solve it the same way this institution has always solved problems, by sacrificing whoever is most vulnerable and hoping that restores stability. But stability built on sacrifice and silence isn't real stability. It's just delayed reckoning. Lady Blackwood leaned forward, her expression mixing frustration with genuine concern. What exactly are you proposing, Your Majesty? What would satisfy you short of the complete destruction of everything we've worked to build? Isabella sat down finally, but her posture remained alert and determined. I'm proposing that we tell the truth. All of it. I'm proposing that the palace release a statement explaining that I sought therapy following pregnancy losses, that this therapy was appropriate and beneficial, and that Henderson's characterizations of my mental health are fabricated. I'm proposing that we acknowledge that seeking professional help for emotional challenges should be normalized rather than stigmatized. Impossible, Sir Geoffrey said immediately. Such a statement would confirm details about your private medical history that should remain confidential. My private medical history is already public thanks to Henderson's lies, Isabella replied. The only question now is whether the public hears lies or truth. Archbishop Williams cleared his throat diplomatically. Your Majesty, even if we were to consider such an approach, surely you can see that it would raise questions about the Council's decision-making process. People would wonder why such drastic measures were necessary if your therapy was appropriate and beneficial. Isabella smiled for the first time since entering the chamber, but it was not a pleasant expression. Exactly, Your Grace. People would wonder about that. They would ask why a queen consort who sought appropriate professional help was being forced into exile. They would question whether the monarchy's decision-making process serves the institution's best interests or simply protects the comfort of its leaders. The implications of her words settled over the room like a cloud. Isabella was not just threatening to contradict their narrative about her mental health. She was threatening to expose the entire process by which the council had decided to remove her. The arbitrary nature of their deliberations, the lack of due process, the prioritization of political convenience over justice or loyalty, all of it would be subject to public scrutiny if Isabella chose to tell her story honestly. Lord Pemberton's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Your Majesty, you are threatening to damage not just the monarchy, but the entire constitutional framework that supports it. The King's Council serves a vital function in advising the Crown on matters of national importance. If our deliberations become subject to public criticism from former family members, the institution cannot function. Then, perhaps the institution needs to function differently, Isabella replied. Perhaps it needs to be more accountable, more transparent, more willing to acknowledge when it makes mistakes or treats people unjustly. Edmund stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like breaking glass. Isabella, stop. Please. You're talking about destroying everything. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and, for a moment, Isabella wavered. This was the man she had loved for 20 years, the person who had been her partner in facing impossible challenges and celebrating unexpected joys. But, then, she remembered the formal distance he had maintained during their private conversation, the way he had spoken to her like a visiting diplomat rather than his wife, the choice he had made to preserve his crown at the cost of their marriage. I'm talking about saving myself, she said quietly. For 20 years, I have defined my worth through service to this institution. I have measured my success by the monarchy's stability and my failure by any threat to its reputation. But I'm not responsible for the monarchy's problems, Edmund. I never was. And I will not accept blame for problems that existed long before I arrived and will continue long after I leave. She stood up again, gathering the unsigned documents and handing them back to Lord Pemberton. I will not sign these agreements. I will not accept exile to Thornfield Estate. I will not pretend that my departure is voluntary or that your decision to remove me is justified by my supposed instability. Then, what will you do? Edmund asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella looked around the chamber one final time, taking in the portraits of advisors who had served the crown for centuries, the magnificent architecture that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the faces of intelligent, well-intentioned people who were trapped in a system that demanded terrible choices. I will pack my belongings and leave the palace, she said. But I will leave as myself, honest, dignified, and unwilling to accept responsibility for failures that belong to all of us. If anyone asks why I'm leaving, I will tell them the truth. If journalists want to know about my therapy with Dr. Morrison, I will explain that it was appropriate medical care that helped me serve this institution more effectively. If people wonder about the council's decision-making process, I will describe exactly what I witnessed in this room. The threat was clear and comprehensive. Isabella was not just refusing to cooperate with their preferred narrative. She was promising to actively contradict it with truth that would be impossible to counter without appearing dishonest or manipulative. You leave us no choice, General Morrison said grimly. If you won't accept reasonable terms for departure, we'll have to pursue other options. What other options? Isabella asked with genuine curiosity. Will you have me arrested for telling the truth about my own life? Will you strip me of titles for refusing to lie about seeking medical care? Will you prevent me from leaving the palace by force? The questions highlighted the fundamental weakness in the council's position. They had assumed Isabella would cooperate in her own exile, because that was what royal family members had always done. They had no effective leverage over someone who refused to play by rules that protected the institution at her expense. Edmund sank back into his chair, looking older than Isabella had ever seen him. Isabella, please. There has to be some way to resolve this that doesn't destroy everything we've all worked to build. Isabella felt a surge of sadness for the man who had once been her partner and was now her opponent. But sympathy could not change the fundamental nature of the choice she faced. There is a way, she said gently. Tell the truth. Acknowledge that I sought appropriate medical care during a difficult period. Admit that Henderson's story is fabricated. Explain that removing me from royal life serves political convenience rather than justice or necessity. Demonstrate that the monarchy can survive honesty and accountability. And if we refuse? Lord Pemberton asked. Isabella picked up her purse and moved toward the door, Margaret falling into step behind her. At the threshold, she turned back toward the council one final time. Then, you'll discover that 20 years of service has taught me a great deal about how this institution really works. And I'll share that knowledge with anyone interested enough to listen. As she left the chamber, Isabella heard the eruption of urgent conversations behind her. She had fundamentally altered the balance of power in their relationship, transforming herself from a problem to be managed into a force to be reckoned with. But, more importantly, she had reclaimed ownership of her own story. Whatever happened next would happen on her terms, in her words, with her truth rather than their convenient fiction. The final stand was over, and Isabella had won the only victory that truly mattered. The right to remain herself. 3 hours after Isabella's dramatic exit from the council chamber, the palace fell into an eerie quiet that seemed to echo through every corridor and settle into every corner like dust after an explosion. Staff members moved through their duties with the careful precision of people navigating a minefield, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all, and avoiding eye contact when they passed each other in the halls. Isabella found herself in her private study, surrounded by the books and personal papers that would need to be packed, but unable to focus on the practical tasks of departure. Margaret sat nearby, periodically glancing at her phone as updates from the outside world filtered in through their remaining contacts in the press office and security detail. The phones haven't stopped ringing, Margaret reported quietly. Sir Geoffrey has called 3 emergency meetings in the past hour. The Prime Minister's office has been in contact twice. There are rumors that Prince Alexander is demanding an immediate audience with His Majesty. Isabella nodded but continued staring out the window at gardens that had been her refuge for 20 years. She was experiencing the strange calm that sometimes follows moments of irrevocable decision, when the die has been cast, and all that remains is to wait for the consequences to unfold. Ma'am, Margaret said hesitantly, there's something else. Dr. Morrison's office has been surrounded by photographers since this morning. He's had to cancel all his appointments and bring in security. The harassment is severe enough that he's considering filing complaints with the press council. This news broke through Isabella's contemplative silence. The idea that her decision to fight back might cause additional suffering for the man who had helped her through her darkest period was almost unbearable. "Get him on the phone," she said immediately. "If he's willing to relocate temporarily, I'll cover all expenses. He shouldn't suffer because he had the courage to defend the truth about our therapeutic relationship." As Margaret made the call, Isabella's attention was drawn to a commotion in the courtyard below. A small convoy of vehicles was arriving, not the usual dignified procession of state cars, but the urgent assembly of crisis management. She recognized several members of parliament among the passengers, along with senior military officials and representatives from intelligence services. "They're treating this like a national security crisis," she murmured, watching the officials hurry into the palace with grim expressions. Margaret finished her call and rejoined Isabella at the window. "Dr. Morrison sends his thanks, but declines any financial assistance. He says that standing up for patient rights and mental health advocacy is part of his professional responsibility. He also wanted me to tell you that he's proud of your courage and that history will vindicate your decision to speak honestly." Before Isabella could respond, there was a sharp knock on the study door. Margaret opened it to find Sir Geoffrey, flanked by two security officers in plain clothes. His usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, his tie loosened, and his face showing the strain of managing a crisis that had spiraled beyond all contingency plans. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice tight with controlled tension, "I need to inform you that certain security measures are being implemented for your protection and the protection of the royal household." Isabella turned from the window, immediately alert to the implications of his formal language. "What kind of security measures, Sir Geoffrey?" "Effective immediately, all communications from your apartment will be monitored for security purposes. Your personal staff will be temporarily reassigned to other duties. And we must ask that you refrain from any contact with media representatives or unauthorized personnel until the current situation is resolved." The meaning was clear: house arrest disguised as protective custody. Isabella felt a surge of anger that was quickly replaced by bitter admiration for the council's strategic thinking. Unable to prevent her from speaking, they were attempting to control when and how she could speak. "I see," she said calmly. "And how long do you anticipate this protection will